Today, you finally found the time to tidy up the attic of your grandmother's old country house. One by one, you toss out dusty boxes filled with useless junk. Suddenly, your eyes catch sight of something with a leather cover. Oh! It's your grandmother's old photo album. Carefully brushing off the dust, you open it and freeze in awe as a flood of memories washes over you. There's your grandmother holding your father, just a little boy at the time. Here they are with your grandfather, who fought throughout the war against the Nazis. Then there are newspaper clippings from the wartime detailing Hitler's surrender and the collapse of his army. And now, as a modern-day person, a simple question pops into your mind. What kind of country gave rise to fascism? Where did Hitler come from, and how did he seize power? Carefully make your way down from the attic and settle in comfortably, because I'm about to answer these questions. To begin, we need to travel back to Germany more than 100 years ago, to 1918. Sometimes, a seemingly insignificant event can drastically alter the course of a nation's history. That's exactly what happened in Germany at the start of the last century. At the time, Kaiser Wilhelm II ruled the country. He was a flamboyant figure, constantly surrounded by intrigue. His rule was marked by a sharp temperament, ambition, and a love for grand gestures. In his dreams, Germany was destined to become a great global power, but his decisions often led to diplomatic crises. Wilhelm's love of military rhetoric and expansionist policies became one of the factors fueling the tensions that led to World War I. This very war would later play a critical role in Germany's economic collapse, but more on that later. For now, let's focus on the situation in the country in 1918. It was the fourth year of World War I. In Russia, Vladimir Lenin had become the head of government. He addressed the warring nations, proposing a peace agreement. At that time, Russia was weakened by revolution and civil war and was in no position to continue fighting. However, Britain, the United States, and France didn't support Lenin's idea. Germany and its allies, meanwhile, signed the so-called Brest-Litovsk Treaty in the city of Brest-Litovsk. Under its terms, Russia exited the war, but at the cost of losing vast territories, including Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and part of the Caucasus. With the treaty in place, Germany shifted its forces from the Eastern Front to the Western Front and began an offensive. However, the nation's financial resources and manpower were stretched to their limits. At this time, the people of Germany were deeply dissatisfied with Kaiser Wilhelm's policies. Uprisings broke out across the country, and workers and soldiers began forming councils, demanding an end to the war and the abolition of the monarchy. Chancellor Max von Baden tried to persuade the emperor to abdicate and transfer power to a successor, but Wilhelm was unwilling to take that step. Discontent among the people continued to grow. Outside, it was autumn, and the exhausted and battered German army longed for peace. However, one German admiral suddenly decided to gather the navy for one last battle, a final act of defiance, so to speak. But the sailors, understanding the futility and suicidal nature of such an order, refused to comply and mutinied. They demanded an end to the war, better living conditions, and the dismissal of officers they saw as cruel and incompetent. The mutiny quickly spread, and workers joined the sailors in their revolt. The government sent troops to suppress the uprising, but instead of firing on their comrades, many soldiers either joined the rebels or refused to obey orders. This escalation only broadened the scope of the rebellion, and the arrest of its leaders further fueled public anger toward the government. Protests spiraled out of control, spreading across the country. Within days, crowds gathered outside the Reichstag. The Reichstag was both the German parliament and the building where it convened. The people, now even more outraged, demanded the emperor's abdication and an end to the war. Realizing the danger posed by the unrest, the chancellor announced that the emperor had abdicated. This, of course, was a lie, but even the government ministers were unaware of the falsehood. In a panic, they scrambled to find someone to lead the country. As the noise of the crowd outside grew louder, one minister, Philip Scheidman, seized the moment. While the others were out to lunch, he stepped onto the balcony and declared the formation of a republic to the people below. The old order has fallen. Long live the German Republic! The crowd calmed down somewhat and began to disperse, unaware that the Kaiser had no idea he'd essentially been overthrown. In Russia, they have a saying for situations like this: they married me off without my consent. Yes, the Republic had been proclaimed, but it didn't stop the public outrage, or, most importantly, the war. The German offensive on the Western Front soon slowed and eventually stalled altogether. Germany lost the war, and a peace treaty had to be signed. But how should it be done? Who would face the people's wrath? Who would take responsibility for the thousands of soldiers' lives lost in vain? German general and politician Erich Ludendorff devised a cunning plan. He proposed forming a new government made up of liberals and social democrats. Let them sign the peace treaty, which was clearly going to be unfavorable to Germany, and let them bear the blame for it afterward. Clever and calculated. Since Germany was now a republic, Friedrich Ebert, one of the leaders of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the largest political party at the time, became the head of state. What do you do when guests are already at your doorstep and you're still in your pajamas? That's right. You make a quick action plan. You decide what needs to be done immediately and what can wait. The most urgent tasks you handle yourself, while the rest you delegate to other family members. Politics works much the same way. The first thing Germany's new government had to do was end the war. That's exactly what Friedrich Ebert did. He agreed to sign a peace treaty with the Allies, then an alliance of Britain, France, and the United States. The victors drafted treaty terms that primarily benefited themselves, but for the Germans, it was a breath of fresh air and the beginning of a peaceful life. The next big challenge was dealing with the communists, those whom Philip Scheidmann, the man who proclaimed Germany a republic, had released from prison. Scheidmann, who had quickly joined the government, had hoped this move would calm public anger. However, the communists immediately began their propaganda, hoping for a scenario similar to what had happened in Russia. Ebert couldn't allow the Communist Party to seize power, so he assigned this problem to the newly appointed Deputy Chief of the General Staff. By promising the army stability in the form of jobs and food, the government secured military support to maintain order and eliminate the communist threat. This task fell to the so-called Freikorps, volunteer units made up of war veterans who couldn't find a place in civilian life. These men weren't skilled with hammers or shovels, but they were adept with Mauser rifles, which made it easy to resolve any conflict with those who stood in their way. Meanwhile, Russia was closely observing the formation of Germany's new Communist Party and provided support. They even sent an advisor envoy to Karl Marx's homeland to share revolutionary experience with communist leaders Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Things remained relatively calm until Ebert replaced Berlin's police chief, who had been lenient toward the communists. The new chief took a much harsher approach, sparking unrest. German communists and far-left social democrats attempted to declare Soviet rule in Germany and began preparing for an uprising. Their effort was swiftly and brutally suppressed by the Freikorps, and both Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were killed without trial or investigation. With this, the communist movement was effectively crushed. However, there was still another significant task at hand. To govern the country, the government needed to establish legitimacy and proper structure. This required elections for a constituent assembly, the adoption of a constitution, and the formalization of the peace treaty. To avoid unnecessary questions and potential public unrest, the government decided to hold the treaty discussions in the small town of Weimar, nearly 300 kilometers from Berlin. That's how the name Weimar Republic came about. It was still Germany, just under a different branding. A new state means new reforms. The first priority was establishing the country's highest office. Germany would now be led by a Reich president, Socialist Friedrich Ebert, who had already been acting as the de facto head of state for months. But now, his position was officially legal. The second highest office, that of Chancellor or Prime Minister, went to Philip Scheidmann, the same man who had proclaimed the new republic from the Reichstag balcony. While the new government of the Weimar Republic was busy implementing reforms, debates over the peace treaty continued in France. It's important to remember that Germany, and specifically Kaiser Wilhelm II, had been blamed for starting World War I and was ordered to pay reparations, compensation for the damages caused by the war. Initially, this amount was set at 20 billion gold marks, nearly 7 tons of gold, but it was later increased to 269 billion gold marks, equivalent to almost 100 tons of gold. To put this into modern terms, that's over $600 billion, an astronomical sum. For Germany, it meant total political humiliation. Realizing the implications, Chancellor Scheidmann refused to sign such an agreement and resigned. He was succeeded by Gustav Bauer, who, after reading the treaty's terms and understanding its devastating consequences, sought to negotiate better terms for Germany. Bauer proposed a few written amendments to the treaty, none of which were particularly significant, as German representatives were not even allowed into the negotiation room. However, the Allies refused to compromise. They demanded that Germany sign the treaty, giving them 5 days to decide. Otherwise, France threatened to resume military action and occupy all of Germany. Recognizing that Germany could no longer withstand a war, Bauer convinced the Constituent Assembly to agree to the treaty. The date and location were set, June 1919 in Versailles. For Germany, both the treaty and the choice of Versailles as the signing venue were profoundly humiliating. On June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the Allies and Germany signed the treaty, officially concluding what was then called the Great War, now known as World War I. The terms of the treaty were so harsh on Germany that, in many ways, they laid the groundwork for the rise of the Nazis just 14 years later. In essence, the treaty wasn't a peace agreement but rather an acknowledgement of Germany's defeat and a total political and economic capitulation. In addition to reparations, the Allies demanded all of Germany's colonies, previously conquered territories, as well as its ships, submarines, planes, and even trains. The treaty drastically reduced Germany's military capabilities and redrew the borders of Europe. The Treaty of Versailles devastated the German people. Protests erupted across the country as citizens rallied against its terms. To calm public outrage and shift blame, German military leaders began spreading a rumor about a political conspiracy, the so-called stab-in-the-back myth. While German soldiers followed their commanders' orders and faced the enemy, treacherous politicians staged a revolution behind their backs. Who was to blame for all of this? No one could provide a clear answer. Generals blamed the parliament, politicians, and the government. The clergy mourned the moral decline of society and pointed fingers at socialism, communism, labor unions, and, at times, Jewish people, accusing them of betrayal. Interestingly, the conspiracy theory was widely accepted by the German people, the Allied powers, and even the government of the new republic, which had signed the humiliating treaty itself. Today, most historians agree that the stab-in-the-back legend significantly destabilized the Weimar Republic and paved the way for the rise of National Socialism. Conservatives were convinced that the country had indeed been betrayed, while Democrats reluctantly accepted that trying to uncover the truth was a hopeless endeavor. But let's leave that debate to historians and move forward. The average German not only believed in the conspiracy theory but also found supposed proof to back it up. What comes to mind when you think of Bavaria? Modern Bavaria or Bavaria of the early 20th century? If you're a beer lover, just hearing the word probably brought a smile to your face. Bavaria is like Germany on steroids, only instead of protein shakes, it's all about beer. It's the land where men wear lederhosen, those iconic leather shorts, and women in flowing dirndls look like they just stepped out of a fairy tale. The heart of Bavaria is beer. Here, a liter of beer isn't a drink, it's considered a light snack. The crown jewel of Bavarian culture is Oktoberfest, where locals and tourists compete in two things: who can drink the most beer and who can sing loud German songs the longest. But Bavaria isn't just about beer. It's also home to the Alps, fairy tale castles, and gingerbread-style towns. And, of course, King Ludwig II, who built the legendary Neuschwanstein Castle, the very one that inspired Disney. That's right, even Disney fairy tales have roots in Bavaria. But that's modern Bavaria. Now let's go back to Bavaria in 1918 to 1919. At that time, Germany was a collection of principalities, or, more simply, a federation. Under the Weimar Republic, the map of the country wasn't redrawn, these principalities were just renamed as republics. Bavaria became one of these republics. In November 1918, amid mass public demonstrations, Kurt Eisner, a member of the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, USPD, declared Bavaria a republic. He formed a provisional government, assuming the roles of both prime minister and foreign minister. Bavaria briefly became a Soviet republic, but it didn't last long. In February 1919, Kurt Eisner was assassinated by a monarchist. His death sparked a wave of uprisings across Bavaria. Within a month, the entire republic was engulfed in revolutionary flames. The new government began forming a Red Army from workers and peasants, arming them to defend their rule. The leaders of Soviet Bavaria were adventurers and demagogues who managed to hold on to power for less than a month. The revolution was soon crushed by the Freikorps, paramilitary units. The communists, in their brief reign, made so many mistakes that the common people turned away from revolutionary ideas for a long time. But that's not the main takeaway here. What's truly fascinating is that in the chaos of the Bavarian Revolution, a certain corporal received his baptism by fire, Adolf Hitler. And here's the twist, he fought, believe it or not, on the side of the communists. Yes, you heard that right. Hitler began his political journey as a proponent of communism, fighting for the German Communist Party. But how did he end up there? How did communist ideas take hold of his mind? Let's try to trace Adolf Hitler's path to Bavaria. Adolf Hitler's father, Alois Schicklgruber, was born out of wedlock. When Alois's mother later married, his stepfather gave him his surname, Hiedler. However, when the local clerk recorded the change, he made a mistake, and the surname became Hitler, a name that would become infamous worldwide. In April 1889, Alois and his wife, who was also his niece, had a son, Adolf. The family lived in Austria-Hungary, where Alois worked as a customs officer. Young Adolf often traveled with his father. It was during these travels that the boy first entertained the idea of uniting Austria with Germany. Why not? The two nations seemed so similar. They spoke the same language and shared close cultural traditions. At the time, this idea was a common topic of discussion. In Austria-Hungary, Germans were the dominant ethnic group, followed by Hungarians, with Slavs and other smaller ethnic groups making up the rest of the population. The idea of uniting German-speaking territories into a single country was a hot topic in the late 19th century, with politicians proposing two approaches. One, the Greater German Solution. This plan aimed to unite Germany with Austria-Hungary under the Habsburg monarchy, which held the largest hereditary crown and commanded a formidable army. However, this would have meant including millions of Slavs and Hungarians in the German state, something many found undesirable. 2. The Lesser German Solution. This path excluded Austria and instead unified the German states under Prussia, led by its chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. In January 1871, the German Empire was born. The King of Prussia, Wilhelm I, was crowned as the German Emperor. Not everyone was satisfied with this outcome. The idea of Pan-Germanism emerged, a cultural and political movement advocating for the political unity of the German nation based on ethnic, cultural, and linguistic identity. The movement gained popularity, and a young Adolf Hitler was swept up by it, dreaming of uniting Germany and Austria. In 1907, the young Hitler moved to Vienna, hoping to enroll in the Academy of Fine Arts. He managed to pass the initial screening despite fierce competition, but his artwork was rejected. His drawings lacked people, featuring only landscapes and architectural scenes. Unable to enroll elsewhere due to not having a high school diploma, he never finished school. Hitler burned through the money left by his mother and began living on the streets, surviving on odd jobs and lacking steady work. During this time, Vienna was governed by Karl Lueger, a staunch anti-Semite and advocate of Pan-Germanism. His speeches resonated with the young Hitler, who became inspired by these ideas. Tired of his vagrant lifestyle, Hitler decided to move to Germany. He waited until he received an inheritance from his father and moved to Munich, where he was caught up in the outbreak of World War I a year later. Fired up by patriotism, Hitler joined the Bavarian Infantry Regiment and headed to the front lines. As a soldier, Adolf Hitler was described in various ways. Some said he wasn't particularly heroic, often staying in the trenches, while others credited him with bravery on the front lines. Some called him a pleasant conversationalist, while others claimed they'd never heard a word from him. We'll leave it to Hitler's biographers to sort that out. What's important to understand is that Germany at that time was consumed by the idea of national unity. This was especially palpable on the front lines, in the trenches, under enemy fire. It didn't matter where you were from, which principality you called home, or what lay ahead of you. Perhaps you'd die in battle, or maybe you'd be wounded, but above all, what mattered was preserving your honor. That's how young soldiers thought, and Hitler was one of them. For him and many others, the war became a lens through which they viewed the supposed uniqueness of the German nation. After the war, Hitler returned to Munich, now engulfed in revolutionary fervor, and unexpectedly became drawn to politics. There wasn't much else of interest at the time. In April 1919, he was even elected to the Council of the Bavarian Soviet Republic. However, after the fall of the Soviet government in Bavaria, Hitler was captured by the Freikorps, right-wing paramilitary units. Facing the threat of execution, he saved himself by betraying his comrades, the most active members of the Communist Party, and agreeing to collaborate with the Weimar government. Interestingly, some of those Freikorps members would later join Hitler in the Nazi Party, which already existed at the time, albeit under a different name. What usually drives progress? What pushes people to think differently, sometimes leading to advancements that benefit humanity? That's right, conflict and contradictions. For example, dim, unreliable oil and gas lamps that constantly needed maintenance and posed fire hazards eventually led humanity to invent the incandescent light bulb. In essence, every contradiction drives the creation of something new. Similarly, in Germany, opposition to the Communist Party, which was established in late December 1918, gave rise to a new party in early January 1919, the German Workers' Party, DAP. The leader and ideological founder of this party was Anton Drexler, the son of a railroad worker who himself worked as a simple locksmith at the time. Drexler was inspired to take this step by the director of the company man, yes, the same company whose trucks and buses with the famous logo are now seen worldwide. Drexler authored one of the first ideological documents of this new movement, the article The Collapse of Proletarian Internationals and the Failure of the Idea of Universal Brotherhood. In it, he promoted the idea of German greatness, specifically targeting the working class. And there were plenty of workers at the time. The Republican government had given them the right to vote and participate in the country's political life. Unfortunately, most workers had no understanding of politics. Various political parties and groups sprang up like mushrooms after the rain. By the end of 1919, there were around 100 such organizations across the country. The DAP, however, had only about 50 members at that time. The government closely monitored these organizations, wary of the possibility that one of them might become a threat. How do you keep everyone on a short leash? Easy, you plant your own people everywhere, informants to keep tabs on everything. That's exactly how Hitler ended up in the German Workers' Party, DAP. He was an informant. That's right, Hitler's political career didn't just start as a member of a soldiers' council, he began as a snitch and a spy. Adolf attended a few party meetings, initially in his role as an informant, but something started to change. Everything the party discussed seemed to make sense. They blamed France, Britain, and, of course, the Jews for Germany's woes. They championed the working class. But young Hitler had a feeling that things needed to be done differently, not just sitting quietly and debating the hardships of the people, but actively mobilizing and uplifting them. At one meeting, he stood up and gave a fiery speech that immediately caught the attention of the party leaders, including Anton Drexler. Impressed by his rhetoric, they invited him to join the party and take charge of its propaganda bureau. Hitler enthusiastically embraced the role. He gave lectures, distributed leaflets, and became deeply involved, forgetting entirely about his original task as an informant. Within a few months, Adolf drafted a new platform for the party, insisting that Drexler add the term National Socialist to its name to emphasize the connection between workers and the idea of national revival. Thus, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, was born, a name now infamous worldwide. A year later, Hitler ousted Drexler and took control of the party. But it wasn't without resistance. The party members attempted to organize a coup against him, trying to expel him from their ranks. Hitler retaliated by accusing Drexler of being an unworthy soldier who lacked the experience and grit needed for leadership. The coup failed, but it was a valuable lesson for Hitler. He immediately created the SA, Sturmabteilung, his stormtroopers and personal bodyguards, perfect for street brawls and maintaining control. Meanwhile, in the Weimar Republic, public distrust in the government was growing. First, many Germans didn't understand what a republic was or what it stood for. The government's composition changed frequently, but President Friedrich Ebert remained in office. The Weimar Constitution, progressive for its time, granted women the right to vote, guaranteed freedom of religion, and allowed for referendums. However, it also contained a clause that enabled the president to bypass the Reichstag and make decisions independently, a loophole that would later have devastating consequences for Germany. Second, there was the problem of endless street unrest. At first, it came from monarchist officers, but later, under the terms of the Versailles Treaty, the government was forced to disband Brigade Ehrhardt, one of the largest Freikorps units. This sparked outrage among nationalists, who staged a rebellion in Berlin. President Ebert fled the city, calling on workers to strike. The strategy worked, and the uprising failed. By 1923, the situation in Germany had become unbearable. The country was in deep crisis in every respect, even before considering the economic collapse. But then, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. Inflation. It seems like such a simple, even elegant word. But how much tragedy it can carry within it. What is inflation? It's the devaluation of money accompanied by a rise in the cost of goods and services. But what causes inflation? 1. The central bank printing unsupported money when there's more national currency circulating, but the amount of goods and services stays the same. 2. Rapid spending by people afraid that tomorrow their money won't buy anything of value. 3. A decrease in GDP. In 1923, all three of these factors converged to send the Weimar Republic into a spiral of runaway inflation. And let's not forget the reparations owed to the Allies. Initially, the Germans attempted to meet the terms of the Versailles Treaty, all the while trying to demonstrate its impossibility. Eventually, they stopped paying altogether, claiming they simply had no money. The French, after some deliberation on how to force Germany to fulfill its obligations, decided to seize the country's most industrialized region, the Ruhr Valley. This move further crippled the already feeble Weimar economy. Inflation then engulfed Germany like Mount Vesuvius burying Pompeii. It grew so severe that workers no longer needed wallets. Instead, they received their wages in suitcases every single day. Erich Maria Remarque described this chaos in his novel Three Comrades. It was the time of inflation. My monthly salary was 200 billion marks. Wages were paid twice a day, and after each payment, we were given a half-hour break to rush to the shops and buy something before the dollar exchange rate changed again, cutting the value of our money in half. Anyone familiar with the writings of revolutionary Lenin will immediately recognize where this is heading. The Weimar Republic found itself in a revolutionary situation. The ruling elites could no longer govern effectively, and the working class no longer wanted to live under such conditions. The communists, with support from Russia, sought to take advantage of this unrest, but the government, led by Friedrich Ebert, crushed all uprisings with an iron hand. Soon, the Berlin government stopped printing money and abandoned its fight against the French in the Ruhr Valley. This sparked outrage among Bavarian patriots, who viewed this move as an act of betrayal. Bavaria declared a state of emergency and assembled an army, planning to march on Berlin. The movement was led by former Bavarian Prime Minister Gustav von Kahr, but he soon faced competition from Adolf Hitler and Erich Ludendorff. Hitler proposed joining forces, but no one took him seriously, which infuriated the Nazi leader. On the evening of November 8th, 3,000 people gathered in the Bergerbrockler beer hall to hear von Kahr speak. Hitler stood near the entrance, wearing a cloak and hat, with a beer mug in hand. Around 9 p.m., he suddenly smashed the mug, shoved his way through the crowd, climbed onto a table, and, just like in the movies, fired a shot into the ceiling. He then declared, "The National Revolution has begun." Without batting an eye, Hitler spun a story for the crowd, claiming that military barracks and police stations had been seized, and that the soldiers and police officers had already joined his cause. He declared the government overthrown. Ludendorff, who knew nothing of the coup, joined him and supported his actions. As the mood in the hall began to turn, Hitler informed the crowd that 600 stormtroopers with machine guns had surrounded the beer hall, and if the crowd didn't quiet down, they would set up a machine gun in the gallery. At this point, he wasn't lying. Meanwhile, the soldiers and police were in no mood to rally under swastika flags. Troops loyal to the government began to converge on the beer hall. Around 10 p.m., Hitler left to try and resolve the impending clash between his stormtroopers and the loyal soldiers. Gustav von Kahr pretended to agree to Hitler's terms, but as soon as Hitler left the hall, Kahr's soldiers attempted to arrest him. Hitler managed to escape. The uprising, later called the Beer Hall Putsch, was suppressed by the army and police forces. A few days later, Hitler was arrested at a safe house and put on trial. He turned his trial speech into a platform for propagating his party's ideals. He made sure to cater to the press, not just the German media, but the international press as well. Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and his party was banned. However, he wasn't deported to Austria, even though he still wasn't a German citizen. The Weimar government was simply lenient towards ultranationalists. In prison near Munich, Hitler was kept in good conditions, his friends and acquaintances were allowed to visit, and to one of them, he dictated the main book of his life, Mein Kampf. We will discuss this book in more detail another time, but for now, let's just say Hitler sold it and made a decent amount of money from it. Hitler was released from prison after a year for good behavior. But when he emerged, the country was hardly the same. Do you remember what triggered the Bavarian uprising? What happened to the country's economy and how inflation spiraled out of control? The Weimar Republic had been, in essence, on its knees over a year ago. Now, however, the situation had drastically changed. How did such a destitute country manage to pull itself out of the economic pit in such a short time? Who was the magician behind this incredible economic miracle? That man was Gustav Stresemann, a member of the National Liberal Party of Germany. He established a new central bank, the Reichsbank, which was backed by land under factories and farms. This bank issued a new currency, the Rentenmark, pegged to the pre-war gold standard. A total of 2.4 billion Rentenmarks were issued. One Rentenmark was exchanged for 1 trillion paper marks. The population began to believe in money without the excessive zeros, and this helped curb hyperinflation. Stresemann became the Chancellor of Weimar and surrounded himself with talented financiers. Germany made a huge leap forward in both economic and political growth. Under Stresemann's leadership, the country emerged from international isolation and joined the League of Nations. By 1929, the Germans realized that this man could lead their country out of its economic deadlock. The German party started to gain popularity, while Hitler's NSDAP began losing its supporters. Perhaps, if Stresemann had not suffered a severe stroke, Hitler might not have risen to power, and World War II may never have happened. But history doesn't say what if. Everything unfolded as it did, nothing can be rewritten. At this time, the president of the Weimar Republic, Ebert, passed away, and he was succeeded by Paul von Hindenburg, who maintained the Republican form of government and its constitution. Hitler began to search for a foundation for a new political movement, and he found it. But this time, it wasn't the working class, but the social layers that had not benefited from the economic growth and had only lost out. These were farmers who suffered from falling grain prices, and the urban middle class, from professors to shopkeepers. State aid bypassed them, and unemployment within their ranks was high. Soon, Hitler met a young follower of German Romanticism, Joseph Goebbels, an excellent propagandist. Goebbels launched a wide-scale propaganda campaign for Hitler's politics in Berlin. The Nazis did a fantastic job promoting their movement ahead of the parliamentary elections, but they lost, securing one of the last places. Hitler realized Germans weren't interested in Nazism. Then he needed to explain to them who was to blame for everything. But while Adolf pondered, a world event occurred that would change the course of history. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed, and money began to flow out of Germany. The Weimar government had no better idea than to raise taxes and cut social benefits. The Republic entered total unemployment, people sold everything they could, and children died from hunger and disease. The government attempts to unite with Austria, thinking it would be easier to endure the hardship together, but Britain and France oppose it. They remind Germany of the Versailles Treaty, yet subtly imply they can hold off on reparations for now. The United States, on the other hand, insists on the reparations being paid. The illusion of a good life in the Republic crumbles like a house of cards in the breeze. Young people no longer trust the government and its democracy. Early elections are held in the Reichstag, and here, with the help of Goebbels, who loudly proclaims that only national unity can save the country, Hitler's party takes second place. These elections showed that the NSDAP had become one of the leading forces in the country. Large German industrialists begin negotiations with Hitler, offering funding and cooperation. Hitler, who sees himself as a people's leader, readily agrees. He understands that without the help of capitalists, whom he publicly scorns, he won't be able to achieve his goals. After the elections, the SA stormtroopers begin terrorizing the city, engaging in street battles and frightening peaceful citizens. Hitler fires the most active leaders of the SA in an attempt to build his authority among wealthy Germans. But the SA doesn't obey Hitler. Instead, they revolt, taking several Nazi party offices. To suppress the uprising, Hitler is helped by the SS, elite Nazi military units. Hitler takes full control of the SA, and now a crowd of thugs is under his command. 2 more years pass, and life for the Germans becomes even harder. Meanwhile, Goebbels continues to promote the idea of national unity and improvement of life. In the new elections, Hitler's party wins, now with over 1.5 million members, including farmers and students who had nowhere to go after finishing university. The government proposes making Adolf chancellor, but with oversight to prevent him from going too far. For the first few months of his rule, Hitler is merely the head of a coalition government. The world wonders how long Hitler can hold on to this position, as he is seen as an upstart and a failure. But Adolf immediately takes advantage of his right to suspend citizens' rights and freedoms in order to end disorder by banning some parties, publications, and introducing censorship. On February 1, 1933, the Reichstag is dissolved again, new elections are called, and the Nazis receive over 40% of the vote. This isn't enough for Adolf, as absolute power is necessary to achieve Germany's world domination. Then, with Hitler's encouragement, the Reichstag passes a law equating the powers of the president and the chancellor. This turns out to be a fatal mistake. Hitler just needs to clear the last hurdle, gain emergency powers to rule without regard for parliament or laws. He convinces Ludwig Kaas, head of the Center Party, to support him in parliament, and Kaas agrees, though not without the assistance of the SA stormtroopers standing nearby. On March 23, 1933, Hitler, with the help of 444 votes in favor and 94 against, many opponents were unable to attend the session, receives emergency powers. From this moment, dictatorship is officially established in Germany in the form we are familiar with. The state is now devoted to 2 main tasks, achieving world domination and bringing the German people in line with the Nazi racial ideals. Why did the Germans agree to hand over power to a fanatic? Can we say that the harsh and humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles led the Nazis to power? Historians do not have a clear answer to this. They are still debating it. Some argue that the Nazis often referred to 1919 as the starting point of Germany's humiliation, talking about the stab in the back and how the country had been brought to its knees by the Versailles Treaty, while they, the Nazis, were the ones to lift it up. However, there was no direct correlation between the Versailles Treaty and the rise in popularity of the National Socialists, which eventually led them to power nearly 1.5 decades after the treaty was signed. Others nod and say, no, it was the conditions of the Versailles Treaty that drove the country into the Great Depression, and Germans saw salvation only in the Nazi Party. They seemed like the lesser evil compared to the Communists, who were also attempting to establish their dictatorship. The Red Terror especially frightened large business owners and aristocrats. To them, Hitler appeared to be a petty clown and a talker, incapable of anything serious. Unfortunately for the world, they were gravely wrong about his abilities.